A millionaire's son steps out on a stormy night and sees a frail, rain-soaked beggar staring at him with unsettling intensity. On impulse, he invites her inside, only for his world to shatter when she whispers, "You are mine." She knows things about his childhood that only his dead mother should know. As he uncovers buried secrets and betrayals, one question remains. Will he accept the truth or walk away forever? Stay with us, because you won't believe what happens next. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The storm hammered against the glass walls of Caldwell Enterprises Tower, turning the city into a blur of neon lights and shadows. Benjamin Caldwell stood in the lobby, his perfectly tailored suit a stark contrast to the chaos outside. He checked his watch. 9:47 p.m. Another late night, just the way he preferred it. The emptiness of the building at this hour gave him a sense of control he craved. Thunder cracked overhead as he pushed through the revolving doors, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble entrance. The black umbrella snapped open with practiced precision, keeping the rain at bay. Droplets scattered around him like tiny missiles. Charles, his driver of 15 years, stood ready beside the sleek Mercedes-Benz, his own umbrella raised against the downpour, collar turned up against the wind. "Evening, Mr. Caldwell," Charles said, reaching for the car door, his weathered hand steady despite the storm. That's when Benjamin saw her. The woman sat hunched on the curb, her thin frame wrapped in a sodden shawl that might have once been blue. Rain ran in rivulets down her face, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes, tired but sharp, were fixed on him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. Small tremors ran through her body, though whether from cold or emotion he couldn't tell. Benjamin frowned. He'd seen her before, hadn't he? Over the past few weeks, always in the same spot, always watching. He'd trained himself to look past people like her. It was easier that way, cleaner. But something about her gaze tugged at a memory he couldn't quite grasp, like a word stuck on the tip of his tongue. "Sir?" Charles's voice cut through his thoughts. "Is everything all right?" Benjamin didn't answer immediately. The woman hadn't moved, hadn't held out a cup or called for help. She just sat there, her eyes never leaving his face. Water dripped from her gray hair, plastered against hollow cheeks that spoke of too many missed meals. Her hands clutched the wet shawl tighter, knuckles white with effort. "Mr. Caldwell?" Charles prompted again, concern creeping into his voice. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the scene in stark white. Benjamin felt something shift inside him, like a crack in a wall he'd spent years building. A familiar ache bloomed in his chest, one he couldn't explain. "Charles," he said, his voice clipped and businesslike, masking the uncertainty he felt. "Bring her inside." Charles blinked, his usual professional demeanor slipping for just a moment. "Sir?" "You heard me." Benjamin turned back toward the building, not waiting to see if his order would be followed. He knew it would be. His footsteps echoed against the marble, each step feeling heavier than the last. Behind him, he heard Charles's gentle voice. "Ma'am? Please come with me. Mr. Caldwell would like you to come inside." The words carried easily despite the storm's fury. The woman, Rose, moved slowly, her joints stiff from the cold and wet. Her shoes, worn nearly through, squeaked against the pavement as she stood. She didn't speak, but her eyes never left Benjamin's back as she followed him toward the warmth of the lobby. Each step seemed to cost her great effort, yet she moved with a determined grace. Charles watched the scene unfold, his umbrella still raised, rain pattering against the black fabric. In 15 years, he'd never seen Benjamin Caldwell acknowledge a stranger on the street, let alone invite one inside. He'd driven past countless people in need, his boss's face always set in stone, eyes forward, mind on the next deal, the next acquisition. The city's desperate had become just another part of the landscape. But tonight was different. Something about this woman had cracked that perfect facade. As Rose's frail figure disappeared into the golden light of the lobby, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing something extraordinary, though he couldn't begin to guess what it was. The air seemed charged with more than just the storm's electricity. The storm continued to rage overhead, but inside the tower's lobby, time seemed to stand still. Benjamin stood near the security desk, his back straight, his expression unreadable, though his hands betrayed his tension, clenching and unclenching at his sides. Rose's wet clothes dripped onto the marble floor, creating small puddles that reflected the warm overhead lights. Neither spoke. Neither moved. They just stood there, two souls connected by something Charles couldn't see, while the city around them disappeared into the storm. The security guard at his desk pretended to look busy, but his eyes kept darting between the unlikely pair, sensing the weight of the moment. Lightning flashed across the Manhattan skyline, illuminating Benjamin's penthouse in brief, stark bursts. The storm that had driven them inside now rattled against the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the city into a watery canvas of lights and shadows. Rose Thompson sat perched on the edge of a plush armchair, looking small, despite the thick cashmere robe Mira had given her after her shower. Her shoulders hunched forward slightly, as if trying to make herself even smaller in the vastness of the luxury surrounding her. The robe probably cost more than Rose had seen in months, Benjamin thought, watching her from his position in the kitchen. Her gray hair, now clean and damp, curled slightly at her shoulders, framing a face lined with years of worry. She kept running her fingers over the soft fabric, as if she couldn't quite believe its reality, her weathered hands moving in constant, nervous motions. Mira moved quietly through the space, her efficiency evident in every motion. She'd worked for Benjamin long enough to anticipate his needs, and now she extended that same careful attention to their unexpected guest. The housekeeper set out delicate china cups, steam rising from the fresh tea she'd prepared, the familiar scent of Earl Grey filling the air between them. "The soup will be ready in a moment," Mira said softly, her voice barely audible over the storm's persistent drumming against the windows. Rose nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the modern art pieces, the sleek furniture, the subtle signs of wealth that Benjamin had accumulated over years of successful business deals. She looked overwhelmed, almost lost in the vastness of the space, like a sparrow that had accidentally flown into a cathedral. Benjamin uncrossed his arms and moved to sit across from her as Mira brought out bowls of steaming soup and fresh, crusty bread. The aroma filled the room, warm and inviting, but Rose just stared at it, as if the simple act of eating in this setting was somehow beyond her comprehension. "You should eat while it's hot," Benjamin said, his voice clipped and businesslike, falling back on the familiar patterns of command that had served him so well in the corporate world. Rose picked up her spoon, her hand trembling slightly. She dipped it into the soup but paused before it reached her lips, the silver hovering uncertainly in the air. Her eyes lifted to Benjamin's face, and that same intense look he'd noticed outside returned. She was studying him, searching his features for something he couldn't understand, her gaze moving across his face like she was memorizing every detail. The scrutiny made him uncomfortable. He was used to being observed, in board meetings, at social functions, by the press. But this felt different, more personal, more unsettling. It stripped away the carefully constructed layers of his public persona, leaving him feeling strangely exposed. "You've been sitting outside my building for weeks," he said finally, breaking the silence that had grown thick between them. "Why?" Rose lowered her spoon, her soup untouched. Her fingers traced the edge of the fine china bowl, and Benjamin noticed they were still shaking, creating tiny ripples in the golden liquid. She drew in a deep breath, her eyes never leaving his face, as if she feared he might disappear if she looked away. "You have his eyes," she whispered, her voice rough with emotion. The words seemed to cost her something vital, as if each syllable carried the weight of years of silent waiting. Benjamin frowned, something in his chest constricting at her words. "Whose?" Rose's breath came out in a shaky exhale, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "My son's." The words hit Benjamin like a physical blow. He gripped his water glass tightly, feeling the cool surface against his palm, anchoring himself to its solid reality. His mother was dead, had died when he was just a baby. That's what he'd always been told. That's what all the documents showed. That's what his father had. But looking at Rose now, seeing the sorrow and recognition in her gaze, something deep in his gut twisted uncomfortably. The certainty he'd carried his whole life suddenly felt less solid, less real, like a foundation crumbling beneath his feet. The silence stretched between them like a living thing, broken only by the steady tick-tock of the pendulum clock on the wall. Benjamin's mind raced, trying to process her words, each tick of the clock hammering against his skull like an accusation. The woman sitting across from him, this frail, homeless person he'd brought in from the rain, claimed to be his mother. It was absurd, impossible, and yet something deep inside him stirred uncomfortably. "You think I'm your son?" he forced a scoff, leaning back in his chair. The words came out sharp and skeptical, cutting through the air between them like shards of ice. Rose flinched at his tone but didn't lower her gaze. Her fingers clutched the warm teacup like an anchor, her knuckles white against the delicate china. "I used to sing to you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, thick with memory. "Every night before bed. Moon River. You would only fall asleep if I hummed it 3 times, and sometimes you'd try to hum along." Benjamin's chest tightened, his heart drumming an erratic rhythm. He'd always had that melody in his head, though he'd never known where it came from. It had been his secret comfort during sleepless nights. "You have a scar," she continued, her eyes moving to his left wrist, tracking the mark as if she'd traced it 1,000 times before. "Right there. You were 2. You were trying to climb the kitchen counter to reach the cookie jar. You fell and hit the corner of the table. I've never forgiven myself for turning away even for that moment." Benjamin's hand instinctively moved to cover the thin white line on his wrist, his fingers trembling slightly. He'd always been told it was a birthmark, a simple quirk of nature. "Your favorite blanket was blue." Rose's voice cracked slightly, her eyes glazing with tears. "It had little yellow stars on it. You wouldn't sleep without it clutched in your tiny fists. You called it Boo. You'd drag it everywhere, even to the bathroom, and throw the biggest tantrums if we tried to wash it." Benjamin's breathing became uneven, each inhale feeling like it wasn't quite enough. These weren't things anyone could know. His adoptive parents, the Caldwells, had told him his biological mother died when he was 2. A car accident, they'd said. He'd never questioned it, never had reason to doubt the story that had shaped his life. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, more to himself than to her, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "You could have researched me, read about me somewhere." But even as he said it, he knew these weren't public details. No magazine article or newspaper column had ever mentioned his childhood blanket or his bedtime lullaby. These were intimate details, precious memories that belonged in a mother's heart. Rose wiped a tear from her cheek, her hand trembling like a leaf in autumn. "They lied to you, Benjamin. They took you from me, and they lied. Every day since then has been empty without you." The words hit him like a physical blow, shattering the carefully constructed reality he'd lived in for 30 years. He stood up abruptly, the force of the movement sending his chair clattering to the floor. The sound echoed through the penthouse like a gunshot, making Rose jump. Without a word, he strode toward his study, his legs moving on autopilot, each step feeling both too fast and too slow. His hands shook as he pulled his phone from his pocket, nearly dropping it twice. The contact list blurred before his eyes as he scrolled to his mother's number. Margaret Caldwell, the woman who'd raised him, who'd given him everything. Everything except the truth, apparently. The name on the screen seemed to mock him now. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring seemed to stretch for an eternity, filling the air with its accusatory tone. "Benjamin?" His mother's familiar voice came through the speaker, warm and concerned, exactly as it had been for 30 years. "Darling, it's late. Is everything all right?" His throat felt tight, constricted, as if all the lies of his life were trying to choke him. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained and unsteady, barely recognizable as his own. "Mom, we need to talk." Benjamin's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he drove up the winding driveway of the Caldwell estate. Manicured gardens stretched in every direction, a testament to the wealth and precision that had shaped his life. Pristine rose bushes and perfectly trimmed hedges lined the path like silent sentinels. The mansion loomed ahead, its limestone facade gleaming in the morning sun, a prison disguised as paradise. His heart hammered against his ribs as he parked. For 36 years, this place had been home. Now it felt like a beautifully wrapped lie, each brick and column mocking him with its familiarity. Margaret appeared at the front door, her silver hair perfectly styled, her cream silk blouse immaculate. Even now, she looked every inch the society matron she'd trained him to become worthy of. Her face lit up with practiced warmth. "Benjamin, what a lovely surprise." She moved to embrace him, arms outstretched, but he remained rigid, watching her smile fade. "What's wrong?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken accusations. Benjamin's jaw clenched. "Did you steal me?" The color drained from Margaret's face, her perfectly maintained composure cracking. Her hand flew to her throat, a nervous gesture he'd seen 1,000 times before, but never understood until now. It was guilt, raw and undeniable. Heavy footsteps approached from behind her. Theodore Caldwell entered the foyer, his presence filling the space like a storm cloud. He must have heard the question from his study. Benjamin watched his parents exchange a look, 30 years of secrets passing between them in a single glance, a silent language of deception. Margaret's hands clasped together, twisting her diamond rings. "We did it because we love you, Ben." Her voice trembled, but there was steel beneath the silk. The admission struck him like a physical blow, leaving him breathless. "So it's true." The words felt like acid in his mouth, burning away the last remnants of his trust. Theodore's face hardened, his features settling into familiar lines of disapproval. "That woman had nothing," he spat, his contempt evident. "You'd have grown up in filth." He said it like he was discussing a business deal gone wrong, not the theft of a child from his mother. His cold logic made the betrayal even more profound. Benjamin's blood boiled, his fingers curling into fists. The casual cruelty of it, the absolute certainty that they'd done right, it made him sick. Years of carefully crafted control threatened to shatter. Margaret stepped forward, desperation creeping into her voice. "We gave you the world, Ben. She would have given you nothing." Her eyes pleaded with him to understand, to accept their version of love. Each word felt like another brick in the wall they'd built between him and his true identity. The rage in Benjamin's chest gave way to something deeper, more painful. His hands trembled as he looked at these people, these strangers who had raised him. "She gave me life," he whispered, his voice breaking on the truth of it. The weight of 3 decades of lies pressed down on his shoulders. He turned away from Margaret's reaching hands, from Theodore's stern disapproval. His mother called after him, her voice echoing through the marble halls, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Each step carried him further from the lie he'd lived, toward a truth he never knew he was missing. The grand front door closed behind him with a sound of finality, leaving behind the only family he'd ever known, and the greatest betrayal he'd ever faced. Benjamin's tires screeched as he sped away from the Caldwell estate, each mile putting distance between him and the beautiful lies he'd been fed his entire life. Rain started falling again, matching his dark mood as the windshield wipers beat a frantic rhythm, struggling to keep up with the downpour. "We did it because we love you." His mother's words bounced around his skull like shards of broken glass. Love. Was that what they called kidnapping now? The very thought made his stomach churn with a mixture of rage and disbelief. At a red light, he slammed on the brakes, the car jolting to a stop. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady his breathing. An elderly woman in the car next to him shot him a concerned look, her weathered face pinched with worry. He ignored her, focusing instead on the raindrops racing down his windshield. The light turned green and he pressed the gas, gentler this time. The rest of the drive passed in a blur until he reached his penthouse building, the doorman's greeting falling on deaf ears as he strode through the lobby. Inside his apartment, Benjamin paced the length of his living room, his designer shoes wearing an invisible path in the expensive carpet. The storm outside had picked up again, rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows with increasing fury. Thunder rolled across the sky, but he barely heard it over the blood rushing in his ears and his own ragged breathing. His phone vibrated on the coffee table. Margaret's face lit up the screen, a photo from last Christmas, both of them smiling at some charity gala, their perfect family facade intact. He turned the phone face down, unable to look at her carefully crafted smile any longer. The landline's sharp ring cut through the silence. 1 ring, 2, 3. Then the answering machine picked up, its mechanical beep echoing in the vast space. "Ben, please." Margaret's voice filled the room, stripped of its usual polish, almost desperate. "You have to understand. We gave you everything, the best schools, opportunities, a future. Don't let her ruin what we have. She's nobody, Benjamin. We're your family." Each word dripped with calculated manipulation that he'd never noticed before. He lunged for the phone, ripping it from the wall and slamming it down on the counter. The plastic cracked under the force, splintering like his trust in the Caldwells. "Nobody?" he whispered through clenched teeth. "She's my mother." The words felt foreign yet undeniably true on his tongue. But doubt crept in, unwanted and persistent like shadows lengthening at dusk. What if Margaret was right? They had given him everything: education, connections, a life of privilege. Would he have had any of this if he'd stayed with Rose? The question haunted him, even as he hated himself for considering it. His phone buzzed again, another missed call from Margaret, then a text. "Your father and I only wanted what was best for you." The words glowed accusingly in the dimness of his apartment. Benjamin grabbed the phone and hurled it onto the plush leather couch. It bounced once before settling between the cushions, like a guilty secret trying to hide. He ran his hands through his hair, tugging at the strands in frustration until his scalp stung. The city lights twinkled beyond his windows, unchanged despite his world turning upside down. He felt drained, hollow, like someone had scraped out everything he thought he knew about himself and left nothing but questions behind. 30 years of carefully constructed identity crumbling in a single evening. His eyes fell on the chair where Rose had sat just hours ago, her hands trembling around a teacup as she shared memories that only a mother could know. His first steps, his favorite lullaby, the tiny birthmark behind his ear that Margaret had never mentioned. He needed to see her again, needed answers that only she could give. The truth was out there, wrapped in Rose's gentle voice and hidden behind years of pain. The evening air had turned bitter cold as Benjamin drove his car slowly down the streets near Caldwell Enterprises. His eyes scanned the sidewalks, looking for Rose, while his knuckles whitened against the leather steering wheel. The familiar spot where she usually sat was empty, making his stomach twist with worry. Street lamps cast long shadows across empty benches and vacant doorways. He turned down another street, relief washing over him when he spotted her hunched figure. She sat against a brick wall, arms wrapped tightly around herself, trying to keep warm in the chilly night air. Her thin shawl offered little protection against the biting wind that whipped through the urban canyon of buildings. Benjamin parked his car and got out, his expensive shoes clicking against the pavement as he approached her. The sound echoed in the quiet street. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice softer than usual, betraying concern he hadn't meant to show. Rose barely lifted her head, her silver hair catching the dim streetlight. "I have nowhere else to be." The words were simple, matter-of-fact without self-pity, though they carried the weight of years of resignation. For the first time, Benjamin truly looked at her, really looked. The deep lines etched into her face told stories of hardship and sorrow, each wrinkle a chapter of pain and loss. Her clothes, though clean from yesterday's shower, were worn thin, threads barely holding together at the seams. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, speaking of countless sleepless nights spent wondering, waiting, hoping. This woman, his mother, had nothing. The realization hit him hard in the chest, making it difficult to breathe. "Get in the car," he said, not unkindly, fighting against the unfamiliar urge to comfort her. Rose hesitated, her eyes darting between him and the vehicle, like a wounded animal unsure whether to trust an offered hand. Finally, she stood up slowly, her movement stiff from sitting on the cold ground. Benjamin resisted the urge to help her, knowing instinctively she needed to do this on her own, though his hands twitched at his sides. The drive to the hotel was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the car's heater and the occasional horn in the distance. Benjamin chose an upscale establishment, not his usual five-star choice, but somewhere comfortable and welcoming with warm lighting and friendly staff. After checking her in, he ordered a variety of foods from room service, noticing how Rose's eyes widened at the menu, her fingers trembling as she touched the leather-bound cover. As they waited for the food, Rose began to speak. Her voice was soft but steady as she told him about the false neglect charges, engineered by people with power and money who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience. She described fighting the system, going to every government office, pleading with every official who would listen, her voice cracking with remembered desperation. But a poor single mother stood no chance against the influence of the Caldwells and their army of lawyers. "They said I was unfit," she whispered, her hands twisting in her lap, fingers interlacing and separating in a nervous dance. "They said I couldn't provide for you. But I worked 2 jobs. You never went hungry. Never." Her voice carried the echo of countless nights spent defending herself against accusations that had torn her world apart. Benjamin sat in the comfortable armchair, his world tilting on its axis. Everything he'd believed about his past, about being saved from an unfit mother who died, crumbled like a house of cards. Each new revelation was another blow to the carefully constructed reality he'd lived in for decades. The food arrived, and Rose ate slowly, carefully as if afraid it might disappear, taking small bites and chewing thoroughly. Between bites, she looked up at him, her eyes full of a mother's love that had weathered decades of separation, a love that had never dimmed despite the years and miles between them. "I never stopped looking for you," she said softly, the words hanging in the air like a prayer finally answered. Benjamin swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion he couldn't quite name. The simple statement rang with truth, and deep down, in a place he didn't even know existed, he believed her. Something long frozen inside him began to thaw, crack, and shift. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Benjamin's corner office, but he couldn't concentrate on the contracts spread across his desk. His eyes kept drifting to the city below, his mind wandering back to Rose's words and the shocking confession from his parents. The usual comfort of his carefully ordered workspace felt hollow today, as if everything he'd built his life around was suddenly made of paper-thin glass. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Caldwell?" His assistant called through the intercom, her familiar voice grounding him momentarily. "A Mr. Moore is here to see you." Benjamin straightened his tie, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "Send him in." He stood, smoothing his suit jacket as the door opened, fighting to maintain his usual composed demeanor. Ethan Moore walked in with quiet confidence, his weathered face betraying years of experience in uncovering difficult truths. He carried a plain manila envelope under his arm, and something in his expression made Benjamin's stomach tighten with anticipation. "Mr. Caldwell," Ethan nodded, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "I have what you asked for." Benjamin gestured to the chairs across from his desk, willing his voice to remain steady. "Please, sit." Ethan settled into the leather chair and placed the envelope on the desk between them. The morning light caught the edges of the manila paper, making it seem to glow. "I looked into her," he said, his voice steady and professional. "And into you." Benjamin stared at the envelope, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. This moment could change everything, or confirm it was all a lie. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for it, betraying the careful control he'd maintained his entire life. Inside, he found carefully organized documents, birth records, adoption papers, police reports. As he scanned them, inconsistencies jumped out at him like red flags waving in the wind. Dates that didn't match, signatures that seemed rushed, almost desperate. Papers filed in unusual order, as if someone had been trying to hide their tracks. Then he saw it. His breath caught in his throat as he read the name on an old birth certificate, Nathaniel Thompson. The paper felt impossibly heavy in his hands, as if weighted down by all its implications. His fingers shook as he turned to the next page. The photograph hit him like a physical blow. A younger Rose, her face bright with joy, holding a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. Her eyes held the same gentle warmth he'd seen just days ago. His eyes were drawn to a small mark on the baby's left wrist, the same crescent-shaped scar he'd carried his whole life, the one his parents had always dismissed as a minor injury from his toddler years. "The evidence is quite compelling," Ethan said quietly, his words cutting through the roar in Benjamin's ears. "There are several irregularities in your adoption records that suggest—" Benjamin barely heard him. He slammed the file shut, his chest tight with emotion that threatened to overwhelm his carefully constructed walls. "Run a DNA test," he managed, his voice hoarse with suppressed feeling. "I need to be sure." The room felt too small suddenly, the weight of his possible true identity pressing in on him from all sides. Nathaniel Thompson. The name echoed in his mind, foreign yet somehow familiar, like a long-forgotten melody from childhood. "Of course," Ethan replied, pulling out his notebook with practiced efficiency. "I can arrange that immediately." Benjamin stood in the hotel hallway, his hand hovering over the door. Taking a deep breath, he knocked. The door opened slowly, revealing Rose in fresh clothes the hotel staff had brought her. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, but she quickly tempered her reaction, as if afraid to hope too much. The slight tremor in her hands didn't escape his notice. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice softer than usual, surprising even himself. She nodded, stepping aside. The room was modest but clean, with morning light filtering through thin curtains. Rose sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, her shoulders tense with anticipation. "I need you to do a DNA test," Benjamin said, getting straight to the point. He watched her carefully, looking for any sign of hesitation or deceit. His years of business negotiations had taught him to read people's reactions, but Rose's openness caught him off guard. But Rose simply nodded. "Of course," she said quietly. "Whatever you need." The gentle acceptance in her voice made something twist inside his chest. The next morning, they visited a private lab Benjamin had arranged through Ethan. The procedure was quick, just a simple cheek swab. Rose didn't flinch, didn't question, didn't protest. She simply followed instructions with a quiet dignity that made Benjamin's chest ache. Her calm compliance only made his own internal turmoil more apparent. The days that followed were the longest of Benjamin's life. He sat through meetings without hearing a word, signed documents without reading them, and stared at his phone as Margaret's name flashed across the screen again and again. He ignored every call, each one making his jaw clench tighter. At night, he'd pace his penthouse looking out over the city lights, wondering how many lies he'd been told, how many truths had been buried. The scar on his wrist. Had Rose really been there when it happened? The blue blanket she described, had it really been his favorite? Each question felt like another crack in the foundation of everything he'd believed about himself. On the fourth day, his phone rang. Ethan's name appeared on the screen, making his heart skip a beat. "The results are in," the investigator said simply. 20 minutes later, Benjamin sat in his office holding a sealed envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal. The paper inside was clinical, formal, filled with scientific terms and numbers. But one figure stood out clearly against the white background: 99.99% match. The words seemed to pulse on the page, each beat matching his racing heart. Benjamin's vision blurred as he read the results again and again. The woman he'd found huddled in the rain. The woman his parents had dismissed as nothing. The woman who'd spent decades searching for him. She was his mother. His real mother. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. He set the paper down on his desk, his hands shaking. Every memory of his childhood suddenly felt tainted. Every birthday, every Christmas, every moment with Margaret and Theodore Caldwell, all of it built on a foundation of lies. The weight of this truth pressed against his chest until he could barely breathe. Each remembered moment now carried a shadow of doubt. a whisper of deception. Rose Thompson wasn't just some homeless woman who'd recognized him. She was his mother, and everything he thought he knew about himself, about his life, about his identity. It was all a carefully constructed facade. The realization settled over him like a heavy blanket, suffocating yet undeniable. The test results lay on his desk. Undeniable proof that his entire world had just shifted on its axis. Benjamin stared at the numbers until they blurred together, the reality of what they meant sinking deep into his bones. His mother was alive. She'd never abandoned him. She'd been searching for him all along. The truth of it echoed through every fiber of his being, reshaping his understanding of not just his past, but his entire existence. Benjamin sat in his dimly lit penthouse, the DNA results trembling in his hands. The city lights twinkled beyond his floor-to-ceiling windows, but he barely noticed them. His eyes kept returning to those numbers. 99.99% match. The truth was there in black and white, impossible to deny. Each time he looked away, his gaze was drawn back, as if the numbers might somehow change if he checked one more time. His phone buzzed again, Margaret's face appearing on the screen for the 10th time that evening. He let it ring, watching until the screen went dark. How many lies had she told him over the years? Every birthday, every Christmas, every moment he'd called her mom. It was all built on deception. The memories felt hollow now, like watching scenes from someone else's life playing in his mind. He wasn't Benjamin Caldwell. That name, that identity, had been carefully constructed by the Caldwells. He was Nathaniel Thompson, son of a woman who had spent decades searching for him, who had never given up hope despite having nothing. The name felt foreign on his tongue, yet somehow right, like a key fitting into a lock he never knew existed. The storm outside grew stronger, rain pelting against the windows like angry tears. Lightning flashed, illuminating his reflection in the glass. He studied his face, the strong jaw he'd always attributed to Theodore, the green eyes he thought came from Margaret's side. All lies. These features belonged to someone else, to a heritage he knew nothing about. He traced his fingers along his jawline, wondering if Rose did the same thing when she was deep in thought. Sleep eluded him that night. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with memories that now felt tainted. The private schools, the expensive clothes, the carefully planned future, all of it came at the cost of stealing him from his real mother. His phone buzzed periodically throughout the night, Margaret still trying to reach him. Each time he turned it face down, unable to deal with her excuses. The soft glow of the screen seemed to mock him with each notification. As morning light crept into his bedroom, Benjamin reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing, "Let's have dinner tomorrow." The words seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what they represented, but they were all he could manage. He held his breath after sending it, unsure what to expect. Rose's response came almost instantly. "Thank you." His heart clenched at the simplicity of her reply. 2 simple words that carried so much weight. He stared at them until his vision blurred, imagining her face as she read his message. Was she crying, smiling? Both? He had so many questions, so many gaps to fill, but the thought of hearing the answers terrified him. Each question felt like a door that, once opened, could never be closed again. Setting his phone down on the coffee table, Benjamin exhaled deeply. The weight of everything pressed down on his chest. He wasn't ready for this conversation. How could anyone be ready to rewrite their entire life story? But he needed to do this for himself, for Rose, and for the truth that had been buried for so long. The morning sun cast long shadows across his floor, marking the beginning of a day that would forever change everything he thought he knew about himself. The private dining room at La Maison gleamed with soft golden light from crystal chandeliers, casting delicate shadows across the cream-colored walls. Benjamin adjusted his tie, watching as Rose carefully settled into her chair, her movements slow and deliberate. Her borrowed dress, one he'd had delivered to her hotel, hung slightly loose on her thin frame, the deep navy fabric highlighting her fragility. Her fingers trembled as she touched the array of silverware before her, clearly overwhelmed by the formal setting and its imposing display of cutlery. "You don't need to use all of them," Benjamin said quietly, noticing her distress. "Just start from the outside and work your way in." He demonstrated with a subtle gesture toward his own place setting. Rose nodded, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach her tired eyes. "Thank you." Her voice was barely above a whisper, rough with emotion. "This is very kind of you." The waiter appeared silently, pouring water into crystal glasses that caught and reflected the chandelier's glow. Benjamin ordered for both of them, keeping it simple: soup to start, followed by roasted chicken with seasonal vegetables. He noticed how Rose's shoulders relaxed slightly at the familiar-sounding dishes, some of the tension easing from her posture. "I remember your first birthday," Rose said suddenly, her eyes taking on a distant look, as if seeing through the years. "We didn't have much. I was living in a tiny apartment, working 2 jobs, waitressing during the day and cleaning offices at night." She smoothed her napkin in her lap, her weathered hands moving in nervous patterns. "But I saved for weeks to buy you this little cake. It wasn't fancy, just a small round thing with blue frosting. The bakery down the street made it special for me." Benjamin found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn into the story despite himself, his usual careful composure slipping. "You were so excited," she continued, a soft smile playing at her lips, bringing warmth to her tired features. "Your tiny hands kept reaching for the frosting. You had the sweetest laugh, like little bells. You couldn't really blow out the candle, so you just—" She mimicked a clapping motion, her eyes brightening at the memory. "You clapped at it, so happy with yourself, bouncing in your high chair?" The soup arrived in delicate porcelain bowls, but Benjamin barely noticed the steaming dish before him. He was lost in the image she painted: a different life, a different beginning. Not the carefully documented, professionally photographed birthdays he'd grown up with, but something simpler, something real, something that tugged at places in his heart he'd thought long closed off. "I made you a stuffed elephant out of old socks," Rose said, her voice growing thick with emotion, her fingers twisting in her lap. "You carried it everywhere, even to the park. Called it Fant. You couldn't say elephant yet." She dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, careful not to smudge her makeup. "You were such a happy baby, always smiling, always curious about everything around you." Benjamin felt something shift in his chest, an ache he couldn't quite name, a longing for memories just out of reach. For a moment he could almost see it, himself as a toddler, clutching a homemade toy, loved not with expensive gifts but with creative determination. The thought made his throat tight, his carefully maintained control wavering. "I used to sing to you every night," Rose continued, lost in her memories. "Just simple lullabies. Twinkle, Twinkle was your favorite. You would hold onto my fingers so tight while you fell asleep." She looked down at her hands, now weathered and thin, marked by years of hard work. "I can still feel it sometimes, that tiny grip. Like it was yesterday." The main course arrived, steam rising from perfectly plated dishes garnished with fresh herbs. Rose fell silent, but Benjamin could see the memories playing across her face, each one etched in the gentle creases around her eyes. For the first time he felt it, a pull toward her, an echo of belonging. This woman had loved him, had celebrated him, had made something from nothing just to see him smile. It shook the very foundation of everything he thought he knew about himself. She wiped another tear from her cheek, her hand trembling. "I never thought I'd have this moment," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "Just to sit here with you, to tell you these things, to see the man you've become." Benjamin swallowed hard and looked away, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. The carefully constructed walls of his world were crumbling, and he wasn't sure how to feel, wasn't sure what to do with the warmth and pain mixing in his chest. His fork lay untouched beside his plate, the food forgotten in the weight of the moment. Benjamin stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor of Caldwell Enterprises, his mind still replaying dinner with Rose from the night before. The warmth in her eyes, the trembling of her hands as she'd served him coffee. It all felt surreal in the harsh light of morning. The sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors and highlighting the golden Caldwell Enterprises logo on the far wall. As he approached his office, his assistant jumped up from her desk, looking flustered, her coffee cup nearly toppling over. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm so sorry. She insisted on waiting inside. I couldn't—" Benjamin held up his hand, already knowing who she was. Through the glass walls of his office, he could see Margaret Caldwell sitting in his chair, looking perfectly composed in her cream-colored designer suit. Her silver hair was styled immaculately, her posture rigid with authority, like a queen on her throne. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, he pushed open the door. Margaret didn't turn around immediately, her fingers trailing along the edge of his mahogany desk as if checking for dust. "You've been ignoring my calls," she said simply, her words sharp as ice. "I've been busy." "Too busy for your mother?" Now she swiveled in his chair, fixing him with that practiced look of disappointment she'd perfected over the years, the one that had made him feel small so many times before. Benjamin remained standing, his hands thrust deep in his pockets. The city sprawled out behind her, a maze of buildings and streets that suddenly felt suffocating, like a golden cage he'd never noticed before. "She's manipulating you," Margaret said, her voice carrying that familiar note of certainty she used when closing business deals, the tone that brooked no argument. Benjamin's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching. "She's my mother." "I am your mother." Margaret leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails pressing into his desk like claws. "That woman waited decades to approach you. Why now? Why when you're at the height of your success?" She stood, smoothing her pencil skirt with practiced precision. "She wants your money, Benjamin. Nothing more. She sees what you've become and wants a piece of it." "You stole me from her," he said, his voice rough with anger and pain that had festered for days. "We gave you everything." Margaret's voice rose slightly, emotion cracking through her polished veneer. "Private schools, summer homes, connections that built your empire." She gestured to the office around them, at the expensive art on the walls and the view that spoke of power. "Look at what you've become. Would you have any of this if we hadn't taken you in? Would you be standing in this office, running this company?" Benjamin felt his chest tighten, his breaths coming shorter. The weight of his privilege, his success, his very identity pressed down on him like a physical force. Every leather-bound book, every crystal award, every framed magazine cover seemed to mock him. "We love you, Benjamin," Margaret continued, her voice softening to that maternal tone that had comforted him through childhood nightmares. "Everything we did was for you. Don't throw that away for some fantasy of a mother who couldn't even keep you fed, who let you go hungry while we gave you the world." She walked around the desk, her heels clicking against the floor like a metronome. Each step felt like a countdown to something inevitable, something that would change everything. "Think about what you're risking," she said, adjusting her pearl necklace. "The Caldwell name opens doors. It commands respect. It's who you are. It's all you've ever been." Benjamin stayed silent, his mind racing through memories of galas and board meetings, of Christmas mornings in the mansion and summers in the Hamptons. Everything she said made logical sense, the kind of cold, practical logic that had shaped his entire life, molded him into the man he was today. Margaret moved closer, reaching out to straighten his silk tie, a gesture she'd done thousands of times before, from his first day of prep school to his Harvard graduation. Her perfume, expensive and familiar, filled his senses with memories of childhood and belonging. "This is your last chance, Benjamin," she whispered, her fingers lingering on his tie like a threat wrapped in silk. "It's either us or her, the woman who gave you life, or the family who gave you everything else." The ultimatum hung in the air between them, heavy with decades of manipulation dressed as love, of control masked as care. Outside his office, the city continued its morning rush, unaware of the war being waged in the glass tower above. The evening sky had turned a deep purple when Benjamin pulled up to the hotel. His conversation with Margaret still echoed in his mind as he walked through the lobby, his footsteps heavy on the polished floor. The elevator ride to Rose's floor felt endless, each floor number lighting up slower than the last, the soft hum of machinery doing nothing to calm his racing thoughts. When Rose opened the door, her face lit up with that gentle smile he was starting to recognize, the one that made the corners of her eyes crinkle softly. She wore a simple cream sweater and navy pants the hotel staff had helped her purchase, the clothes still carrying the crisp newness of recent tags. The sight made his chest tighten. She looked so hopeful, so eager to see him, like a flower turning toward sunlight. "Come in," she said softly, stepping aside with a grace that belied her years. Benjamin entered the modest hotel room, noticing how she'd kept everything meticulously tidy, as if trying to prove something. A small notepad sat on the bedside table, filled with what looked like handwritten memories, the pages dog-eared and well-worn from constant handling. They sat down, Rose on the edge of the bed, Benjamin in the armchair by the window. The city lights twinkled behind him, casting shadows across the room, dancing across their faces like silent witnesses. The silence between them grew thick, heavy with unspoken words and years of lost time. Finally, Benjamin cleared his throat. I need time." The words felt like stones dropping from his mouth, each one heavier than the last. Rose's smile faded slowly, like a sunset disappearing behind clouds, taking with it the warmth in her eyes. She nodded, her hands finding the edge of her sleeve, fingers working nervously at the fabric, pulling at a loose thread. "I understand," she whispered, though her eyes told a different story, filled with a pain she couldn't quite hide. Benjamin watched as she seemed to shrink into herself, her shoulders hunching slightly, making her appear smaller in the oversized sweater. She looked so fragile in that moment, like a dried leaf ready to crumble at the slightest touch. "Just don't take too long," she said, her voice barely audible, trembling like an autumn leaf in the wind. She lifted her eyes to meet his, and for the first time he saw real fear there, raw and unguarded. "I don't have forever." The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Of course, she wasn't young anymore. The years of searching, of living on the streets, had taken their toll, etched in every line on her face. Time wasn't just a luxury for contemplation. It was a ticking clock he hadn't considered, counting down moments he couldn't afford to waste. He left shortly after, the weight of her words following him down to the lobby like a shadow he couldn't shake. That night, sleep eluded him completely. He tossed and turned in his king-sized bed, his mind racing between Margaret's threats and Rose's plea, the sheets tangling around him like the complications of his life. When morning finally came, Benjamin reached for his phone, squinting at the screen through eyes gritty with exhaustion. Several missed calls scrolled past. Margaret, his father, his assistant, each name a reminder of the life he was supposed to be living. But one notification made his stomach drop. A voicemail from the hotel manager. With trembling fingers, he pressed play. The message was brief, professional, but the words sent a chill through his body that no amount of morning sunshine could warm. Rose was gone. She'd checked out early that morning, leaving no forwarding address, vanishing like mist in the dawn. Benjamin sat up, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. The morning sun streamed through his bedroom windows, painting everything in a deceptively cheerful light, but he felt cold all over, as if winter had settled in his bones. She was gone. Just like that. Gone. Taking with her the possibility of answers he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. Benjamin's head throbbed as he blinked awake, the morning light harsh against his eyes. He hadn't slept well. Rose's face from the night before kept appearing in his dreams, her sad smile and quiet understanding haunting him. Every time he'd closed his eyes, he'd seen the way her hands had trembled slightly, as she'd wished him good night. Reaching for his phone on the nightstand, he squinted at the screen. 10 missed calls from Margaret, a dozen work emails marked urgent, 3 text messages from his assistant about an upcoming board meeting. But one message made his stomach drop, a notification from the hotel manager where Rose was staying. "Mr. Caldwell, I wanted to inform you that your guest, Ms. Thompson, checked out early this morning." Benjamin sat up straight, suddenly wide awake, The silk sheets pooled around his waist as his fingers trembled slightly as he dialed the hotel's number. The manager answered on the second ring, his voice professionally neutral. "I just got your message," Benjamin said, his voice tight. "What do you mean she checked out?" "She came down around 5 this morning, sir, handed in her keycard and left. She seemed composed, if that helps." "Did she say where she was going?" Benjamin was already getting dressed, phone pressed between his ear and shoulder, fumbling with his closet door in his haste. "No, sir, she didn't mention anything, just thanked us for our hospitality." "Check the security footage," Benjamin demanded, buttoning his shirt with one hand while scanning the room for his car keys. "I need to know which direction she went." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a clearing of throat. "I apologize, Mr. Caldwell, but our hallway cameras were down for maintenance last night. We only have lobby footage of her walking out." Benjamin's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. Of course, the one time he needed the cameras, they weren't working. "Send me that footage, now." "Right away, sir." He ended the call and stood in the middle of his bedroom, running a hand through his disheveled hair. The space around him felt suddenly vast and empty, the morning sun casting long shadows across his expensive furniture. All his life he'd been surrounded by wealth, by things that could be bought or controlled. But now, faced with Rose's disappearance, none of that mattered. The Persian rugs, the original artwork, the custom-built furniture, it all felt hollow. His phone buzzed. The hotel had sent the footage. With shaking hands, he watched as Rose's small figure walked through the lobby, carrying nothing but a worn bag that had seen better days. She paused at the door, looking back for just a moment, her face catching the soft light of dawn before stepping out into the early morning darkness. Benjamin's grip tightened on his phone until his knuckles turned white. For the first time in his life, he felt truly powerless. Money couldn't fix this. Power couldn't bring her back. He'd spent so long building walls around himself, reinforcing them with achievements and acquisitions, and now that he finally wanted to let someone in, she was gone. He stared at the frozen image of Rose on his screen, her last look back at the hotel capturing everything he'd been too afraid to face. The gentle slope of her shoulders, the way she held herself with quiet dignity even in retreat. She was his mother, and he'd let her walk away. The weight of that truth settled heavy in his chest, an unfamiliar ache that no amount of success or control could ease. For a man who'd spent his entire life gaining and maintaining power, this loss felt different. It wasn't about business or money or status. It was about connection, the very thing he'd been running from since learning the truth about his adoption. Now, standing in his luxurious penthouse surrounded by everything money could buy, Benjamin Caldwell felt something he'd never experienced before. The crushing weight of losing something truly irreplaceable. The morning silence seemed to mock him, echoing with all the words he should have said. Days melted together as Benjamin buried himself in work, but nothing could distract him from the hollow feeling in his chest. His office, once a sanctuary of control and purpose, now felt suffocating. The familiar leather chair creaked beneath him as he shifted restlessly, unable to focus on the documents scattered across his desk. Every time his phone rang, he hoped it would be Rose, but it never was. He spent countless hours driving through the city streets, his eyes scanning every corner, every alley, every shelter. The city lights blurred together as night after night passed without success. Charles had noticed his boss's distraction, the way his gaze would drift to the sidewalks as they drove, searching for a familiar face. Sometimes Benjamin would order the car to stop abruptly, thinking he'd caught a glimpse of her, only to face another disappointment. But Rose was nowhere to be found. On the fourth day, exhaustion finally caught up with him. His head pounded from lack of sleep, and the weight of guilt pressed heavily on his shoulders. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and even his usually pristine suit looked rumpled. He pulled into Jefferson Park, needing a moment to breathe. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching under his expensive shoes as he walked aimlessly along the path, his hands thrust deep into his pockets against the chill. That's when he saw her. Rose sat alone on a weathered wooden bench, her thin frame almost lost in the oversized sweater she wore. Her silver hair caught the afternoon sunlight, creating a soft halo around her face. Her eyes were fixed on some distant point, unseeing, lost in thought. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile than before, as if the weight of their last encounter had physically diminished her. Benjamin froze mid-step, his heart hammering against his ribs. Should he approach her? After how he'd hesitated, after practically pushing her away with his uncertainty, would she even want to see him? His feet felt rooted to the spot as doubt crept in, his fingers clenching and unclenching nervously at his sides. But then, as if pulled by some invisible thread, Rose lifted her head. Their eyes met across the distance, and time seemed to stand still. The busy park faded away until there was nothing but this moment, this connection between a mother and the son she'd lost so many years ago. The chattering of nearby children and the rustle of leaves became distant, meaningless sounds. His legs moved before his mind could catch up. Each step felt heavy with the weight of 36 years of separation, of lies, of lost moments they could never get back. The gravel path crunched beneath his feet, marking each second that brought them closer together. As he got closer, he could see the resignation in her eyes, the quiet acceptance of someone who had learned to expect disappointment, but beneath it flickered a tiny spark of hope she couldn't quite extinguish. Benjamin's throat tightened as he approached the bench. All his wealth, all his power, all his carefully constructed walls. None of it mattered now. His perfectly tailored suit and designer watch seemed absurd in the face of this simple truth. Here was the reality he'd been running from, sitting on a park bench in a worn sweater, her weathered hands twisted together in her lap. He didn't sit beside her. Instead, he lowered himself to one knee in front of her, looking up into the face that should have been familiar all these years. The face that should have smiled at his graduations, celebrated his successes, comforted his failures. His voice came out rough with emotion, barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." Two simple words that carried the weight of decades. Tears welled in Rose's eyes, but she remained silent, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trembling slightly with the effort to maintain her composure. The park bench creaked softly as Benjamin sat down beside Rose. Wind rustled through the trees, sending yellow and orange leaves dancing around their feet like nature's confetti. Neither spoke at first, both lost in the weight of everything that had happened. The city sounds felt distant here, muffled by the thick blanket of tension between them, leaving only the whisper of branches swaying overhead. Rose's hands trembled slightly in her lap, her fingers twisting together nervously. Her clothes were worn but clean, a faded blue sweater and simple black pants that she'd clearly tried to keep presentable despite having so little. Benjamin noticed how she hunched her shoulders, making herself smaller, as if afraid to take up too much space in the world that had been so unkind to her. After what felt like forever, Rose broke the silence. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, fragile like tissue paper, carrying years of longing. "Are you happy?" The question caught Benjamin off guard, making his carefully constructed walls waver. In all his years of success, of building his empire and living the life the Caldwells had given him, no one had ever asked him that so directly. The answer came easier than he expected, rising from a place of truth he usually kept buried. "No." The word felt heavy on his tongue, but true, like finally setting down a burden he'd carried for too long. Rose sighed, turning her face away from him, her gray hair catching the light. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across her weathered features, highlighting every line that time and worry had etched there. "I never wanted to be a burden." Her voice cracked on the last word, decades of pain bleeding through, making her whole body seem to shrink even further. Benjamin exhaled sharply, something in his chest constricting at the sight of her distress. "You're not." The words came out stronger than he intended, almost defensive, surprising them both. Without thinking, he reached for her hand. It felt small in his, cold and frail, the skin paper-thin over delicate bones, marked with age spots and tiny scars from years of hard work. But when she didn't pull away, something inside him softened like ice melting in spring, washing away years of doubt and distance. For the first time since learning the truth, he allowed himself to see her not as Rose Thompson, not as a stranger who had upended his life, but as what she truly was, his mother. The woman who had given him life, who had loved him first, who had spent decades searching for him while he lived in ignorant privilege just miles away. The words came naturally, surprising even him with their simplicity and truth, flowing from someplace deep in his heart he thought he'd locked away forever. "Come home, Mom." Tears welled in Rose's eyes, spilling over and trailing down her cheeks in silvery tracks. But these weren't the tears of sorrow he'd seen before. These were different, lighter somehow, filled with relief and hope, like the first rays of sunrise after the longest night. She nodded, a small, gentle movement, her lips trembling into a smile. "Okay." The heavy oak doors of the Caldwell mansion creaked open as Benjamin stepped inside. The familiar scent of leather and old money filled his nostrils, but today it made his stomach turn. Everything felt different now, tainted by lies and manipulation. His footsteps echoed through the marble foyer as he made his way to his father's study, each click of his shoes against the cold floor a reminder of the countless times he'd walked this path before, always the dutiful son. Just as he expected, Margaret and Theodore were waiting for him. His mother sat perched on the edge of an antique armchair, her manicured fingers clasped tightly in her lap, while Theodore stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel. The flames cast dancing shadows across their faces, making them look older, more tired than he remembered. The tick of the grandfather clock in the corner marked each second of the heavy silence. Margaret's face lit up when she saw him. She rose quickly, smoothing her designer dress with trembling hands. "Oh, Ben, I knew you'd—" "Stop." The word cut through the air like a knife. Margaret froze mid-step, her hand still outstretched toward him. The hope in her eyes flickered and died, replaced by a flash of fear he'd never seen before. "You don't own me anymore." Benjamin's voice was steady, controlled, but beneath it ran a current of steel. The words felt foreign on his tongue, yet somehow right. Theodore scoffed, turning from the fireplace. His face hardened into the familiar mask of disapproval Benjamin had known all his life. The firelight caught the silver at his temples, highlighting the deep lines of authority etched into his features. "So you're choosing her over us?" Benjamin's jaw tightened. He looked around the study, at the leather-bound books, the expensive artwork, all the trappings of wealth that had defined his life. Every gilded frame and polished surface seemed to mock him now. "I'm choosing the truth." Margaret's perfectly composed facade cracked. She took a small step forward, her voice trembling like autumn leaves in the wind. "She will never be able to give you the life we did." Benjamin exhaled slowly, meeting her gaze. In her eyes, he saw decades of carefully constructed lies beginning to crumble. "She already gave me something more valuable. The truth." The words hung heavy in the air like storm clouds before rain. Theodore's face darkened with anger, while Margaret's crumpled in despair. She sank back into her chair, tears welling in her eyes, her perfectly applied makeup beginning to smear. Benjamin turned to leave, his steps measured and deliberate. Behind him, he could hear Margaret's quiet sobs, but he didn't look back. He couldn't. With each step toward the door, he felt the weight of their lies falling away, replaced by something lighter: freedom. The portraits of generations of Caldwells seemed to watch him go, their painted eyes following his departure from the life they'd crafted for him. Margaret watched through tear-filled eyes as her son walked away, knowing with crushing certainty that she had lost him forever. The sound of the study door closing behind him echoed through her heart like a final goodbye. The Caldwell mansion disappeared in Benjamin's rearview mirror, growing smaller until it vanished completely, swallowed by the winter night. His shoulders relaxed, and he took his first deep breath in what felt like years. The tension that had been his constant companion slowly uncoiled, releasing its grip. Soft snowflakes danced in his headlights as he drove through the quiet streets of the city, each mile taking him further from the rigid expectations of his past and closer to something authentic and true. The city lights sparkled through the falling snow, creating a gentle glow that reminded him of Christmas mornings, but not the elaborate staged affairs at the mansion, filled with cold opulence and distant relatives. No, this felt more like the simple, magical moments Rose had described from his earliest days, when a single toy and her warm embrace had been enough to fill his world with joy. When he stepped into his penthouse, he found Rose exactly where he'd left her, perched by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the snowfall. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, her weathered face softening into a smile that reached her eyes, wrinkles deepening with genuine warmth. "You're home," she said simply, and for the first time, those words held real meaning, resonating within him like a comforting melody. Benjamin shrugged off his coat, letting the warmth of the room chase away the winter chill that clung to his skin. Rose watched him carefully, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes following his every move. There was something different about him, a lightness in his movements as if a heavy weight had been lifted from his shoulders, allowing him to stand taller, breathe easier. He moved to the bar, his fingers trailing over the crystal decanters before selecting a bottle of red wine, a vintage he knew Rose would appreciate. The liquid gurgled softly as he poured 2 glasses, the rich aroma filling the air between them, promising a shared moment of peace. He handed one to Rose, who accepted it with slightly trembling fingers, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the room. They sat together on the plush sofa, the city spread out below them like a blanket of twinkling stars, each light a silent witness to their reunion. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt right, like they were finally allowing themselves to simply exist in each other's presence, not as strangers bound by DNA, but as mother and son, connected by a love that transcended time and circumstance. Rose took a small sip of wine, then began to hum softly. The melody floated through the room, gentle and sweet, carrying with it the echoes of a love that had never faded. Benjamin's hand tightened around his glass as recognition sparked in his mind, a sudden warmth spreading through him. This wasn't just any lullaby. It was his lullaby, the one she'd sung to him as a baby, when the world was simple and pure, filled with the promise of love and protection. The notes wrapped around him like a warm blanket, bringing with them fragments of memories he didn't know he had, the feeling of being safe, loved, protected. His eyes burned as he listened, letting the melody bridge the decades that had separated them, healing the wounds of the past with each tender note. The fireplace crackled softly in Benjamin's penthouse, casting a warm glow across the elegant living room. Rose sat in a plush armchair, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea, while Benjamin settled into the sofa across from her. The city lights twinkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, and gentle snowflakes drifted past like tiny stars. Neither spoke for a long while, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt natural, like the quiet understanding between people who had always known each other. Rose watched the flames dance in the fireplace, her face peaceful for the first time since Benjamin had met her. "There's so much I don't know about you," Benjamin said finally, his voice soft but steady. Rose's eyes crinkled as she smiled. "And so much I want to know about you." Benjamin leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What was I like? As a baby?" "Oh." Rose's eyes grew distant with memory, but her smile remained. "You were curious about everything, always reaching for things, always wanting to explore. You'd wake up early just to watch the sun rise through the window." "Really?" Benjamin found himself smiling too. "And you loved music. Even before you could talk, you'd hum along when I sang." They traded stories back and forth. Benjamin told her about his first business deal, how nervous he'd been despite his confident exterior. Rose shared memories of his first steps, his first words, the way he used to chase butterflies in the park. "What about—" Benjamin hesitated, then pressed on. "What about my father?" Rose's expression shifted slightly and she looked down at her tea. That's a story for another time, if you don't mind." Benjamin nodded, respecting her hesitation. "Of course." "I know we've lost so many years," Rose said softly. "So many birthdays, holidays, moments we can never get back." "We have," Benjamin agreed, feeling the weight of those lost years. "But we're here now, Rose reached across the space between them and took his hand, squeezing it gently. Her touch was warm from holding the teacup. "We start where we are." Benjamin looked at their joined hands and nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. For the first time in his life, everything felt right. The aroma of fresh coffee and something sweet drifted through Benjamin's penthouse, pulling him from sleep. For a moment, he lay there confused. His housekeeper, Mira, never came this early. Then he remembered. Rose was here. His mother was here. He got up slowly, running a hand through his disheveled hair. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. As he walked down the hallway, the smell grew stronger, accompanied by the soft clinking of dishes and a gentle humming. In the kitchen, Rose stood at the stove, her silver hair neatly combed, wearing the simple dress he'd bought her yesterday. She was flipping pancakes with practiced ease, moving around his modern kitchen as if she'd always belonged there. The sight made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar warmth. She looked over her shoulder, giving him a hesitant smile. "You used to love these," she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. "Every Sunday morning I'd make them for you. You'd sit in your high chair making such a mess." She chuckled quietly at the memory. Benjamin walked closer, watching as she expertly flipped another golden brown pancake onto a growing stack. "I still love pancakes," he admitted, surprising himself with the confession. "Some things never change," Rose said, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "You wouldn't eat them unless they had tiny chocolate chips. Just a few, scattered through the batter." She gestured to a small bowl of chocolate chips on the counter. "I remember everything about you, Benjamin. Every little detail." He leaned against the counter, watching her work. She moved with a quiet grace, despite her years on the streets. There was something peaceful about watching her cook, something that made his usually rigid shoulders relax. "You used to stand on your tiptoes," she continued, her voice soft with remembrance. "Trying to see what I was doing. Such a curious little thing." She poured more batter onto the griddle. "I'd let you help sometimes, though you mostly just made a mess." Benjamin found himself smiling, a real smile that reached his eyes. The morning light filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over the kitchen. Everything felt different somehow. Softer, warmer, more like home than his expensive penthouse had ever felt before. Rose placed a steaming mug of coffee in front of him, made exactly how he liked it. He raised an eyebrow in surprise. "I noticed how you took it yesterday," she explained simply. She moved around the kitchen with purpose, gathering plates and syrup, her movements careful but confident. This wasn't the frail woman he'd found on the street anymore. Here, in this moment, she was simply a mother making breakfast for her son. Benjamin sat at the table as she set a plate in front of him. Perfect golden pancakes dotted with tiny chocolate chips, just as she'd described. The familiar scent wrapped around him like a warm blanket, stirring something deep in his memory. For the first time in his life, his luxurious penthouse felt truly like home. The evening sun cast long shadows through the penthouse windows as Rose explored her new home. She'd been hesitant to look around too much, not wanting to overstep, but Benjamin had insisted she make herself comfortable. In the back of a walk-in closet, tucked behind designer suits and shoes, she spotted a dusty cardboard box. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled it out. The box was worn at the corners, sealed with yellowed packing tape that crackled as she carefully peeled it back. Inside, memories waited like buried treasure. There were photographs. Benjamin at various ages, his smile becoming more reserved as the years progressed. School awards, report cards, and childhood drawings filled with bright crayon colors. Her heart ached as she sifted through these pieces of a life she should have witnessed. "Benjamin?" she called softly, her voice catching. "Could you come here for a moment?" She heard his footsteps approach, measured and steady. He appeared in the doorway, his expression curious. "What is it?" "I found something," she said, gesturing to the box. Benjamin knelt beside her, his usual composed demeanor slipping as he looked at the contents. His fingers brushed over a drawing of what appeared to be a rocket ship, signed in wobbly letters. Benjamin, age 6. I remember this, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Rose watched his face carefully as he sorted through the items. Then she saw it. Tucked at the bottom of the box was a baby blanket. The blue fabric was faded, its edges worn soft from years of use, but she would have recognized it anywhere. Benjamin lifted it slowly, running his thumb over the material. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of a memory he couldn't quite grasp. The blanket seemed small in his hands now, but Rose could still picture him as a toddler, clutching it close as he slept. I don't remember this, he said quietly, but his grip on the blanket tightened slightly. Rose blinked back tears, her vision blurring. You always held on to it, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Even when they took you away. The morning air was crisp as Benjamin's car wound its way through the quiet streets leading out of the city. Rose sat beside him, her weathered hands gently stroking the faded baby blanket in her lap. She hadn't said much since they'd left the penthouse, but Benjamin could feel the weight of her anxiety filling the car. Dark clouds hung low in the sky, threatening rain. Benjamin gripped the steering wheel tighter, his own stomach churning with what they were about to face. The cemetery was tucked away in a peaceful corner of the suburbs, surrounded by old oak trees whose leaves rustled in the cool breeze. As they pulled through the iron gates, Rose's breath caught audibly. Benjamin parked the car and walked around to help her out, noticing how her hands shook as she took his arm. They walked in silence past rows of granite headstones, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Benjamin had been here before, many times as a child. The Caldwells had brought him to visit his mother, another cruel piece of their elaborate lie. His jaw tightened at the memory as they approached the familiar spot under a sprawling maple tree. Rose stopped abruptly, her grip on his arm tightening. There it was, a polished granite headstone with her name etched deeply into the stone. Rose Marie Thompson, beloved mother, 1956 to 1987. The date of her supposed death was just months after they had taken Benjamin away. They buried me alive, Rose whispered, her voice barely audible. Her fingers traced the carved letters of her name, tears falling freely now. And I believed them. Every time they told me you were better off without me, I believed them. Benjamin watched as she sank to her knees in front of the grave, the baby blanket still clutched in one hand. The sight of his mother, his real mother, confronting her own fabricated death made his chest tight with anger and grief. For 36 years, Rose continued, her voice breaking, I was a ghost. Walking around, breathing, but dead to the world. Dead to you. She pressed her palm flat against the cold stone, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Benjamin knelt beside her, taking her free hand in his. It was cold, just like that first night he'd found her in the rain. You're here now, he said firmly, squeezing her hand. That's all that matters. Rose nodded, but her tears continued to fall silently as they knelt together before the lie set in stone. Benjamin sat at his desk, the morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office. His fingers moved mechanically over the keyboard as he reviewed quarterly reports, but his mind kept drifting to Rose and their visit to the cemetery yesterday. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Caldwell? His secretary's voice was hesitant. Your father is here to see you. Benjamin's shoulders tensed, but he kept his expression neutral. Send him in. Theodore Caldwell strode into the office like he owned it, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his silver hair immaculately styled. The same commanding presence that had intimidated Benjamin throughout his childhood now felt hollow, like a magic trick he'd finally figured out. I see you've been busy, Theodore said, his tone deceptively casual as he placed a thick manila folder on Benjamin's desk. Benjamin didn't reach for it. What do you want? Theodore's lips curved into a cold smile. Open it. With deliberate slowness, Benjamin flipped open the folder. Inside were legal documents, yellowed with age but still binding. His eyes scanned the text, catching phrases like conditional inheritance and moral clause. His stomach tightened, but he kept reading. It's quite simple, Theodore said, settling into one of the leather chairs across from Benjamin's desk. Your position, your wealth, your very name. It all depends on remaining loyal to this family. Benjamin closed the folder. You mean being controlled by this family? Call it what you want. Theodore's voice hardened. That woman, she's nothing. She has nothing. And if you choose her, you'll have nothing too. Benjamin studied his father's face. The stern lines, the unwavering certainty that money could buy anything, even love. For the first time, he saw not a powerful man, but a desperate one. Without hesitation, Benjamin slid the folder back across the desk. Keep it. I'd rather have the truth than your money. Theodore's face darkened, his mask of control slipping. You'll regret this. Benjamin leaned back in his chair, feeling lighter than he had in years. No, Dad. I think I'm finally free. The silence that followed was heavy with decades of manipulation finally shattered. Theodore stood, straightening his jacket with sharp movements. His carefully constructed world was crumbling, and for once, he couldn't buy his way out of it. The city lights twinkled like scattered stars beneath the darkening sky as Benjamin stepped onto his penthouse balcony. The December air was crisp, carrying the promise of snow. Rose stood at the railing, her thin frame wrapped in a warm sweater he'd bought her. Her eyes were distant, fixed on the glittering horizon as if searching for answers in the urban landscape below. Benjamin moved beside her, his hands sliding into his pockets. The silence between them felt comfortable now, no longer charged with uncertainty. He watched his breath form small clouds in the cold air before speaking. Christmas is next week. Rose nodded slightly, her fingers tightening on the railing. She didn't respond, but Benjamin could read the tension in her shoulders, the way she seemed to make herself smaller. He recognized it now, the instinct to minimize herself, to avoid being a burden. It was a habit born from years of loss and rejection. The words came to him naturally, surprising even himself. Come with me, to the Caldwell family dinner. Rose turned to him sharply, her eyes wide with disbelief. You want me there? Benjamin studied her face, the deep lines etched by years of worry, the careful hope in her eyes that she tried so hard to hide. She looked simultaneously stronger and more fragile than when he'd first found her on that rainy night. Yes, he said firmly. I want you there. But... Rose wrapped her arms around herself, a protective gesture. Your parents, they won't want to see me. I don't want to cause trouble for you, Benjamin. You're not causing trouble, he said, his voice gentle but firm. You belong there. Rose's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Are you sure? Benjamin nodded, his voice steady and certain. I've never been more sure of anything. The city hummed below them, a constant reminder of the world continuing its endless cycle. But up here, in this moment, time seemed to pause as mother and son stood together, facing an uncertain future with newfound determination. The Caldwell estate glowed like a beacon in the winter night, its windows ablaze with warm light. Crystal chandeliers sparkled inside, casting prismatic reflections across the marble floors. 3 enormous Christmas trees, each decorated in gold and silver, dominated the grand foyer. The air smelled of cinnamon and pine, mixing with the subtle perfumes of Boston's elite who filled the space. Benjamin felt Rose's hand trembling in his as they stepped through the massive front doors. She wore a simple but elegant navy dress he'd insisted on buying her, her silver hair styled neatly. The moment they crossed the threshold, the bustling party fell silent. The abrupt hush spread like a wave, conversations dying mid-sentence as heads turned toward them. Rose's grip tightened on his arm. Benjamin squeezed back gently, his jaw set with determination. The crowd parted unconsciously, creating a path through the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits. Margaret spotted them from across the room. She stood near the largest Christmas tree, a champagne flute frozen halfway to her lips. The color drained from her face, her practiced society smile crumpling. In seconds, she was striding toward them, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. What is she doing here? Margaret's voice cut through the silence, sharp as broken glass. Her eyes darted between Benjamin and Rose, pure shock morphing into barely contained fury. The gathered guests began to whisper, their hushed voices creating a low buzz of speculation. Benjamin could hear fragments of their conversations. Who is she? That woman from the news? The Caldwells must be mortified. Benjamin straightened his spine, meeting his adoptive mother's gaze steadily. She's my mother. The words rang clear in the hushed room. Margaret's face contorted, a mix of disbelief and rage twisting her carefully maintained features. Several guests gasped. Theodore appeared behind his wife, his expression dark and threatening. "This is a disgrace," Margaret hissed, her perfectly manicured hands clenching into fists at her sides. Benjamin's voice remained steady, carrying across the silent room. "Lies are a disgrace. The truth isn't." Margaret glared at him, her eyes glassy with unshed tears of humiliation. In that moment, she knew. Her carefully constructed world of appearances and control had crumbled. The truth she'd buried for decades stood before her, impossible to deny. The grand dining hall of the Caldwell estate fell into an uneasy silence. Crystal glasses and fine china gleamed under the warm glow of chandeliers, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the tension in the air. Margaret's perfectly made-up face had frozen in an expression of shock, her lipsticked mouth slightly parted. Around the long mahogany table, guests exchanged worried glances and whispered behind manicured hands. Rose stood beside Benjamin, her slight frame trembling despite her best efforts to appear composed. Her fingers were clasped tightly together, knuckles white with tension. The navy dress she wore seemed to make her look both elegant and vulnerable at the same time. Benjamin drew in a deep breath, his shoulders squaring as he reached for his crystal wineglass. The soft ring of silver against crystal cut through the whispers as he tapped it gently. "I'd like to make an announcement," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. The remaining murmurs died away immediately. Margaret shot him a warning glare from her seat at the head of the table, but Benjamin's expression remained resolute. He lifted his chin slightly, a gesture that reminded many of Theodore's own commanding presence. "Many of you know me as Benjamin Caldwell," he continued, his voice steady and clear. "But I was born Nathaniel Thompson." The reaction was immediate. Gasps echoed around the table like a wave. Several guests nearly dropped their silverware, the clinking adding to the chaos of the moment. An elderly aunt clutched her pearls, while a business associate of Theodore's actually stood up slightly before remembering himself and sitting back down. Theodore remained perfectly still in his chair, his face an unreadable mask, but his hand gripped his armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. Margaret's fingers wrapped around her wineglass as if it were a lifeline, her perfectly polished nails tapping against the crystal in an erratic rhythm. Benjamin turned to Rose, his expression softening as he looked at her. "This is my mother," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that made several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. "My real mother." Rose blinked rapidly, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. Yet she stood straighter, lifting her chin in a gesture that mirrored her son's. Despite her simple appearance among the wealth and opulence surrounding them, she carried herself with quiet dignity. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the inevitable wave of reactions, more gasps, whispered exclamations, the scraping of chairs as people leaned toward each other to exchange shocked comments. One guest knocked over a water glass, the liquid spreading across the pristine white tablecloth like a slowly expanding stain. Margaret's face had transformed from shock to fury, her carefully maintained composure cracking like fine porcelain. Her chest heaved with barely controlled emotion, her fingers now white-knuckled around her wineglass. Without warning, she shoved her chair back, the legs screeching against the hardwood floor in a sound that made everyone wince. The noise echoed through the vast dining room as she stood up, trembling with rage and humiliation. Without a word, she turned and stormed out of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, leaving a wake of stunned silence behind her. The heavy silence that followed Margaret's dramatic exit seemed to press down on the elegant dining hall like a physical weight. Crystal glasses clinked nervously as guests shifted in their expensive chairs, some avoiding eye contact while others whispered behind raised hands. The Christmas tree lights twinkled in the corner, casting dancing shadows across faces filled with shock and curiosity. Theodore sat at the head of the table, his fingers drumming slowly against the pristine white tablecloth. His steel-gray eyes fixed on Benjamin with the same calculating look he used in business negotiations. "So this is it?" he asked, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "You're choosing her over us?" Benjamin stood tall beside Rose, whose weathered hands were clasped tightly together. He could feel her trembling slightly next to him, but her chin was raised with quiet dignity. "I'm not choosing one over the other," Benjamin replied, his voice clear and steady. "I'm choosing the truth." Theodore scoffed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "You'll regret this." The threat in his voice was unmistakable, carrying the weight of years of control and manipulation. Benjamin glanced at Rose, taking in her kind eyes and the gentle smile lines around her mouth, features that now seemed so familiar. He turned back to Theodore, his resolve strengthening. "No, I won't." The tension stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Then from somewhere down the table, an uncle who usually remained silent at family gatherings slowly raised his crystal glass. "To Benjamin," he announced, his voice gaining strength with each word, "for having the courage to face the past." There was a moment of hesitation before another glass raised, then another. Like dominoes falling, more guests joined in, some tentatively, others with growing confidence. The sound of chairs shifting and glasses clinking filled the air as the tide began to turn. Theodore watched it all with a hardening expression, his jaw clenching as he witnessed control over his son slipping through his fingers like sand. His knuckles turned white around his untouched wine glass as more people stood, raising their glasses in support of Benjamin's truth. The penthouse was quiet after the storm of emotions at the Caldwell estate. Outside, snow fell softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows, creating a peaceful backdrop to the glittering city lights below. The Christmas tree in the corner cast a warm, gentle glow across the modern space, its lights reflecting off the polished surfaces. Rose stood near the tree, her small frame dwarfed by its grandeur. Her fingers touched one of the crystal ornaments delicately, as if afraid it might shatter under her touch. The light caught the tears in her eyes, making them shimmer like the decorations she admired. Benjamin watched her from across the room, struck by how fragile she looked in such a vast space. Her worn sweater and simple slacks were a stark contrast to the luxury surrounding her, yet somehow she belonged here more than anyone else ever had. The weight of the evening's events settled around them like a comfortable blanket. "I never thought I'd have this moment," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The words hung in the air, heavy with decades of loss and longing. Benjamin crossed the room slowly, his footsteps soft against the hardwood floor. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, feeling her trembling slightly beneath his touch. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of years of missed opportunities for comfort. "You gave me back my son," she whispered, reaching up to cover his hand with her own. Her fingers were warm despite their frailty, and Benjamin felt something shift inside his chest. A piece of himself he hadn't known was missing falling into place. They stood there together, watching the snow fall outside, the Christmas lights casting soft shadows around them. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was filled with understanding and newfound peace. Rose turned to face him, tears glistening in her eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Merry Christmas, Nathaniel," she said softly. Benjamin exhaled slowly, feeling the name settle over him like a familiar blanket. For the first time, it didn't feel foreign or wrong. It felt like coming home. The morning sun filtered through the penthouse windows, casting long shadows across Benjamin's bedroom floor. His phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand, another missed call from Margaret. He'd been ignoring them since last night, but something about the frequency made his stomach twist uncomfortably. When her text came through, "Please, just one conversation." Benjamin stared at the screen for a long moment. His thumb hovered over the delete button, but memories of his childhood flooded his mind. Despite everything, she had been there for every scraped knee, every achievement, every heartbreak. 2 hours later, he found himself walking into a quiet cafe in a less fashionable part of town. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered. Margaret sat in a corner booth, her hands wrapped around an untouched cup of coffee. She looked different. Her usually perfect hair had a few strands out of place, and her designer outfit seemed hastily chosen. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. Benjamin slid into the seat across from her but didn't speak. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle hum of the cafe's background music. "I was trying to protect you," Margaret finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Benjamin's hands clenched into fists under the table. "By erasing my real mother?" Margaret flinched at the word real, but she didn't argue. Instead, she closed her eyes for a moment, gathering herself. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of what?" Benjamin's voice was sharp but controlled. "Of losing you." Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted her coffee cup. "When we first saw you, you were so small, so perfect. We couldn't have children of our own, and there you were. I convinced myself that we could give you a better life." Benjamin watched her carefully, noting how her usual mask of perfection had cracked, revealing something raw underneath. "That wasn't your choice to make," he said firmly. "I know that now." Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "But back then I only saw what I wanted to see. I told myself I was saving you, but really—" She paused, swallowing hard. "I was saving myself." The admission hung heavy in the air between them. A waitress approached their table but quickly retreated, sensing the tension. "Do you know what you took from her?" Benjamin asked, his voice low but intense. "She spent decades believing she'd lost everything." Margaret's shoulders sagged slightly. "I know I can't undo the past, but—" Her voice wavered, something Benjamin had never heard before. "I hope you'll forgive me one day." Benjamin stood up slowly, pushing his chair back. "I need time," he said simply, leaving Margaret alone with her cold coffee and regrets. The gentle melody of Silent Night drifted through Benjamin's penthouse as he sat in his favorite leather armchair, coffee cup warming his hands. Outside, snow fell in lazy spirals, coating the city in a pristine white blanket. The morning felt surreal. His first Christmas knowing the truth about who he really was. He watched the snowfall, lost in thought. Part of him wondered if Margaret was sitting in her usual spot by the bay window of the mansion, where she'd always enjoyed her morning tea. The familiar pang of complicated emotions twisted in his chest. The intercom's buzz broke through his reverie. "Mr. Caldwell," the doorman's voice crackled. "A courier just delivered a letter for you." Minutes later, Benjamin stood in his kitchen, turning the cream-colored envelope over in his hands. He recognized the paper immediately, the same expensive stationery Margaret had always used for her correspondence. His name was written on the front in her usually perfect script, though the letters seemed shakier than normal. With careful movements, he opened the envelope and unfolded the single page inside. The coffee in his stomach turned cold as he began to read. Margaret's words were different this time, stripped of their usual polish and pretense. "I don't expect forgiveness," she had written, "but I was wrong, and I regret the choices I made." Benjamin's hands trembled slightly as he continued reading. "If I had the chance to do it all over again, I would have chosen differently. I hope one day you can find it in your heart to understand why I did what I did, and that you can be happy, truly happy with the mother you were meant to have." He had to read the words twice to believe them. Margaret Caldwell, the woman who had orchestrated every aspect of his life with unwavering certainty, was admitting she had been wrong. In all his years, he had never heard her apologize for anything. The weight of her words settled heavy in his chest. He folded the letter with the same precision she had taught him, creasing each edge perfectly. Walking to his study, he pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk and placed the letter inside. He wasn't ready to forgive her, the wound was still too fresh, the betrayal too deep. But he couldn't bring himself to throw the letter away either. so he closed the drawer, letting it rest there with all the other complicated pieces of his past. His chest felt heavy, but his eyes remained dry. Some emotions were too complex for tears. The sweet aroma of cinnamon and fresh coffee wafted through the penthouse as Rose moved about the kitchen, humming Silent Night under her breath. Her weathered hands worked with practiced care as she arranged plates and silverware on the marble counter. The morning light filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow across her face as she worked. Benjamin leaned against the doorframe, watching her. Something about the scene made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar warmth. The stark, modern kitchen that had always felt more like a showpiece than a home now radiated comfort and belonging. Rose's presence had transformed the space, making it feel lived in and real. "The pancakes are almost ready," she said without turning around, as if she could sense him there. Her voice carried a gentle contentment that made the moment feel even more precious. They sat down to eat, the table set with careful simplicity. Steam rose from their coffee cups as snowflakes danced outside the window. Rose's pancakes were golden brown, dotted with blueberries. Nothing fancy, but somehow perfect. Halfway through the meal, Rose's movements became hesitant. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a small package wrapped in simple red paper. The wrapping was slightly worn at the edges, as if it had been handled many times over the years. Benjamin raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" Rose's smile was soft, touched with both joy and old pain. "Something I've held on to for 36 years, she said quietly. "I've carried it with me everywhere, hoping someday I'd be able to give it to you." Benjamin carefully unwrapped the package, his usually steady hands trembling slightly. Inside was a photograph, its edges worn soft with time. The colors had faded to gentle sepia tones, but the image was clear. Rose, much younger, holding a baby. Her face was radiant with love as she gazed down at the infant in her arms. His breath caught in his throat. The baby, him, had his tiny hand wrapped around her finger, fast asleep against her chest. Something about seeing this moment, this proof of their connection, made everything real in a way that even the DNA test hadn't. Benjamin couldn't speak. He just stared at the photo, taking in every detail. His finger gently traced the outline of their figures, as if touching the paper could somehow bridge the decades that had been stolen from them. "Merry Christmas, Mom," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. Rose wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "Merry Christmas, my son," she whispered, her words carrying the weight of 36 years of waiting. Benjamin stood motionless in his office, the morning sun casting long shadows across his desk. The leather folder before him contained everything he'd been raised to value. The documentation of his place in the Caldwell Empire, stock certificates, trust fund papers, inheritance agreements. His entire life, measured out in legal terms and dollar signs. His fingers traced the embossed Caldwell logo on the cover. For decades, this name had been his identity, his prison and his crown. Now, looking at it, he felt nothing but a quiet certainty that he no longer needed any of it. He closed the file with deliberate care and reached for another folder. This one new, its corners still crisp. Inside were the preliminary plans for something that actually mattered. The Rose Thompson Foundation for Homeless Mothers and Children. His heart beat faster as he reviewed the mission statement he'd drafted himself. "No mother should lose her child to poverty," he whispered, remembering Rose's tear-filled eyes as she told him about their separation. The foundation would provide housing, legal aid, and support services. Everything his mother had needed but couldn't access all those years ago. Benjamin pulled out his checkbook and wrote the first donation himself, $50 million. His hand didn't shake as he signed it. This wasn't just money anymore. It was purpose. He reached for his phone, pressing the speed dial for his lawyer. "James, I need you to draft the paperwork immediately. I'm leaving the Caldwell Corporation." He paused, listening to the expected protests. "No, this isn't up for discussion. I want a clean break." The lawyer's voice grew more urgent, listing all the reasons this was a mistake. The wealth, the power, the prestige he'd be walking away from. Benjamin just smiled, his eyes drifting to the photo on his desk, Rose holding him as a baby. "I've made my decision," he said firmly. "Draft the papers." He ended the call and leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. The weight of expectations, of manufactured gratitude, of obligation, it all lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in his life, he was truly free. The snowflakes danced outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting delicate shadows across the warm, inviting space. The room glowed with the soft light of carefully strung decorations, and the sound of gentle Christmas music filled the air. Rose Thompson stood before the towering Christmas tree, her weathered hands carefully placing the final ornament, a delicate crystal star that caught the light and scattered tiny rainbows across the walls. Benjamin watched from the doorway, a steaming cup of coffee warming his hands. The past year had transformed this space from a cold, sterile showcase of wealth into something entirely different, a home. Photos lined the walls now, some old and faded, others new and bright, each telling a story of reconnection and healing. "It's been a year," Rose said softly, her voice carrying a hint of wonder as she stepped back to admire her handiwork. The tree sparkled with a mix of elegant decorations and homemade ornaments they'd crafted together over the past few weeks. Benjamin nodded, moving to stand beside her. "A good year," he agreed, his voice warm with contentment. The Thompson Foundation, which he'd established in Rose's name, had already helped dozens of homeless mothers and their children find stability and hope. His new business ventures, focused on community development rather than mere profit, were flourishing in ways the Caldwell empire never had. But more than any professional success, it was the simple moments that meant the most. Sharing morning coffee with his mother, listening to her stories, learning about his early years through her eyes. The void that had always existed in his heart, even amid all his previous success, had finally been filled. Rose adjusted a ribbon on one of the branches, humming softly, that same lullaby she'd sung to him as a baby. Benjamin closed his eyes, letting the familiar melody wash over him. The tune carried him back to fragments of memories he didn't even know he had, warm echoes of a love that had never truly been lost. The penthouse, once a symbol of his isolation, now resonated with the kind of warmth that no amount of money could buy. Family photos adorned the walls, handmade quilts draped across furniture, and the kitchen always smelled of home-cooked meals. This wasn't just a space anymore. It was where he belonged. Benjamin opened his eyes to find Rose watching him, her face soft with understanding. She reached out and squeezed his hand gently, a gesture that had become familiar over the past year. Neither needed to speak. They both knew how far they'd come, how much healing had taken place within these walls. Rose turned back to the tree, resuming her gentle humming. Benjamin stood beside her, listening to the lullaby that had crossed decades to find him again. For the first time in his life, he was truly, completely home. If you enjoyed the story of Rose, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.